The story of this unusual aircraft goes all the way back to 1938. That is when the British Air Ministry issued a specification for a new medium bomber. This aircraft was meant to replace the well-known Bristol Blenheim in Royal Air Force service. The most interesting part of this request was the requirement to rely as little as possible on scarce aviation-grade aluminum. Instead, designers were supposed to use non-strategic materials like ordinary wood and low-alloy steel. On top of that, the production process had to be simplified to the point where even small, poorly equipped facilities could assemble the aircraft. Simply put, the military needed a mass-produced wartime bomber that was as simple and cheap as possible, requiring almost no rare strategic materials. Two well-known companies took on this ambitious task: Bristol Aeroplane and Armstrong Whitworth. Bristol developed a design called the Type 155, basing it on their Beaufort torpedo bomber, but equipping it with more powerful Hercules engines and a twin tail. Armstrong Whitworth proposed their own concept, the AW-41. This was a twin-engine, mid-wing monoplane with tricycle landing gear, a major innovation for British aviation at the time. The aircraft's defensive armament consisted of a 4-gun dorsal turret and a twin-gun ventral position. All of these were .303 caliber machine guns. The designers considered 3 possible power plant options, including the Rolls-Royce Merlin, Bristol Hercules, and Armstrong Siddeley Deerhound engines. In August 1938, Bristol decided to halt work on their bomber because they were heavily tied up developing the new Beaufighter. As a result, the AW-41 design was left as the sole contender. The Air Ministry issued an updated specification for it, and on August 18th, they officially ordered the construction of 2 prototypes. By September, engineers had assembled a full-scale mock-up of the aircraft with Merlin engines, but soon changed the design to install Hercules engines instead. A 4-gun dorsal turret was mounted on the upper fuselage, slightly offset to the left of the center line to allow the crew to easily move through to the tail section. 2 more machine guns were placed in a remote-controlled ventral turret. The gunner who operated it sat in the glassed-in tail section of the bomber. The main Armstrong Whitworth plant was operating at full capacity, producing Whitley bombers. Consequently, the construction of the first 2 AW-41 prototypes was subcontracted to a smaller firm called Air Service Training. By that point, the new aircraft had already received its official name, the Albemarle. Even before a single prototype had been built, the government went ahead and placed massive pre-orders for a total of 998 aircraft. The plan was to involve over 1,000 small subcontractor factories for its large-scale production. The Albemarle made its first flight on March 20, 1940. At the controls was veteran test pilot Charles Turner Hughes, but flight testing proved to be a major disappointment. The actual performance of the aircraft fell far short of the calculated estimates. The mixed wood and steel construction added so much extra weight to the bomber that even its powerful engines simply weren't enough. Each of these engines produced 1,535 horsepower on takeoff. The takeoff roll was excessively long and problematic. Designers had to hastily increase the wingspan and later expanded the area of the tail fins to improve the directional stability of the aircraft. Testing dragged on until February 1941, when the first prototype was lost in a severe crash. Flight testing did not resume until April, once the second prototype was completed. Under the original plan, production aircraft should have been rolling off the assembly lines in massive numbers by this point, with production slated to start in June 1940. The military expected to have 496 bombers delivered by July 1941. But reality intervened. The first production aircraft wasn't completed until September 1941, and it wasn't handed over for service until October 23rd. Thanks to endless design changes and constant delays, the Albemarle became hopelessly obsolete. It never had great flight characteristics to begin with, and now it couldn't even come close to competing with the latest British and American bombers entering RAF service. In the end, they only built 32 aircraft of the B Mark I variant. Designed as a conventional day bomber, these few aircraft rarely saw use in their intended combat role. Getting these aircraft to frontline squadrons dragged on just as badly as production had. Eventually, the top brass made a sensible call, deciding to turn this failed bomber into a high-speed transport for airborne troops. In this new role, it was supposed to replace the completely obsolete Whitley transports. Accordingly, those massive initial orders placed at the start of the project were slashed to a much more modest 600 aircraft. Engineers developed several specialized modifications for airborne operations, with the main differences coming down to armament and specialized equipment. They created transport variants designated as the ST series. For example, the ST Mark I featured a dedicated starboard side jump door for paratroopers, and 99 of these were built. They also produced the ST Mark II, ST Mark V, and ST Mark VI versions. Alongside the transports, they built dedicated glider tugs designated as the GT Mark I and GT Mark VI. The unique Albemarle Mark IV, however, remained a one-off prototype powered by American Wright twin Cyclone engines. One thing these variants had in common was the removal of the ventral gun turret, though the tail glass was retained. On the ST series transports, the heavy Bolton-Paul dorsal turret was swapped for a much more compact twin-gun rose mount. This setup featured twin Vickers K machine guns housed under a sliding clear canopy. Additionally, many of these aircraft and every single GT series tug were fitted with specialized towing gear used for hauling heavy assault gliders. The Albemarle finally entered combat service in October 1942, when the first ST Mark I variants were delivered to No. 511 Squadron. This squadron was flying critical transport routes between England and Gibraltar. Around the same time, 2 Albemarles were handed over to No. 161 Special Duties Squadron, a unit flying highly dangerous missions supporting the French resistance. Under the cover of darkness, these aircraft would slip unnoticed into the airspace over German-occupied France to drop weapons, ammunition, medical supplies, and equipment at designated drop zones, as well as covertly inserting reconnaissance teams. It sounded like the perfect role for this type of aircraft. In practice, however, RAF leadership quickly realized the Albemarle was not well suited for these operations, and they were withdrawn from the squadron by March 1943. In late 1942, RAF Command began forming 3 new squadrons, the 295th, 296th, and 297th. In January 1943, the 296th Squadron was equipped with the B Mark I variant, but it only flew a single combat mission before being reassigned to a transport role. By late spring, the squadron was re-equipped with ST Mark I transports and deployed to North Africa. There, these aircraft hauled various cargo right up until July 1943. That was when, during the massive Allied invasion of Sicily, the Albemarle saw its first real trial by fire. On July 9th, 25 Albemarles took off and headed for the Sicilian coast, towing CG-4A gliders packed with American airborne troops. 17 of those gliders successfully touched down near Syracuse, allowing the troops to dig in and secure a beachhead. Following this, the squadron regularly dropped reconnaissance and sabotage teams tasked with capturing or destroying key enemy targets. Naturally, these missions came at a cost, with Albemarles frequently lost to enemy fighters and heavy anti-aircraft fire. For instance, on July 13th, glider-borne troops secured a strategically vital bridge, but the transport group lost 4 aircraft in the process. The 296th Squadron remained heavily involved in operations across Italy through October 1944. They successfully dropped recon teams into Genoa, La Spezia, and other hotspots. One of their most unique missions took place in August 1944 when the squadron conducted a decoy airborne drop off the Italian coast. To confuse the Germans and draw their attention away from the actual offensive, crews dropped a massive wave of dummy paratroopers. As for the 295th Squadron, it did not see direct combat. Between October 1943 and July 1944, its Albemarles performed a routine but essential job, towing cargo gliders on a regular route between England and Northern Ireland. In contrast, the 297th and 570th Squadrons were handed much more dangerous assignments. In February 1944, they dropped vital supplies deep behind enemy lines into secret drop zones near Cannes set up by the French resistance. These flights were incredibly successful, largely due to a remarkably low loss rate. Over the course of 57 combat sorties, the 570th Squadron lost only a single aircraft. In the summer of 1944, the 297th and 570th Squadrons joined No. 38 Group, under the command of Air Vice Marshal Hollinghurst. This unit was specially trained for the massive airborne drops during the Allied invasion of France. On D-Day, Albemarle's towed the heavy Horsa gliders to the French coast. Although German anti-aircraft fire shot down one of the tow planes, the operation was a success, and all 20 gliders reached their targets. Another 6 aircraft carried out a critical mission by dropping the Pathfinders, who were the very first paratroopers to engage in combat. Later, on September 17th and 18th, the 297th Squadron conducted similarly challenging operations near Arnhem, bravely deploying units of the 1st Airborne Division into the combat zone. Despite a few isolated successes, this aircraft certainly did not win over British pilots. It had an incredibly long takeoff roll, and it was sluggish and unwieldy both in the air and while taxiing. On top of that, crews complained about the terrible lateral visibility from the cockpit. Picture this. Just to safely taxi around the airfield, a crew member had to pop out of the upper hatch and literally use hand signals to guide the pilot. The cockpit ergonomics were also terribly designed. To reach the landing gear or flap controls, the pilot had to bend down extremely far, completely losing forward visibility. During the takeoff roll, this created a deadly hazard. Worse still, the Albemarle's single-engine handling was abysmal. In an engine-out scenario, you could only maintain altitude if the good engine was pushed to absolute maximum power. By that time, the British aviation industry was already rolling out much better aircraft. Highly successful transport variants of the Halifax and Stirling were entering service, along with the spacious, high-capacity York, which was based on the famous Lancaster bomber. At the same time, massive numbers of legendary C-47 and C-53 Dakotas were arriving from the United States. In terms of performance and reliability, they were head and shoulders above the troubled Albemarle. All of this led to an inevitable conclusion. In September 1944, production of the unsuccessful aircraft was permanently shut down, and by November of that same year, it had completely disappeared from the frontline units of the Royal Air Force. Soviet pilots, who also had to fly these aircraft during World War II, completely agreed with their British colleagues. But how did these aircraft end up in the Soviet Union in the first place? Back in 1942, the Soviet Air Force was facing a severe shortage of just about every type of aircraft. That is exactly why the Soviet ambassador in London, Ivan Mikhailovich Maysky, agreed to accept a batch of 200 of these transports. To make it official, the governments of Great Britain and the Soviet Union signed a formal agreement in October 1942. The job of ferrying the Albemarles was given to experienced crews drawn from the 1st Transport Aviation Division, commanded by Colonel Vladimir Mikhailovich Korotkov. Every crew was made up entirely of officers, ranging from lieutenants to colonels, including transport pilots like Alexander Sergeyevich Shornikov, Grigory Alexeyevich Taran, and Semyon Alexeyevich Frolovsky. To help the Soviet crews transition to their new British aircraft, a special training center was established at RAF Errol in Scotland, near the city of Dundee, in January 1943. Even before heading to the UK, the pilots went through a quick familiarization course on foreign aircraft in the Soviet Union. Using American-built Douglas Bostons, for example, they were taught how to take off and land with tricycle landing gear, which was necessary because Soviet aircraft of the era were still strictly taildraggers. Just getting to Scotland turned into quite the ordeal for the Soviet aviators. The luckiest ones got to fly comfortably to London straight from the Moscow area on board a spacious RAF Liberator bomber. Those who were less fortunate first had to endure a long, bumpy train ride to Arkhangelsk. From there, they were ferried to Lake Krasnoye, a spot where PBY Catalina flying boats patrolling the northern maritime convoy routes would occasionally land. The toughest journey fell to those who sailed to the UK by sea, stuck on board transport and naval ships under the constant threat of U-boat attacks. On January 11th, the first 3 Soviet pilots and 3 flight engineers arrived in Dundee. Just a few days later, the first 2 training aircraft were ferried to the base, and the first training flights began on January 21st. Before long, a second group of trainees arrived from the Soviet Union. Starting in February, intensive training for Soviet radio operators got underway at RAF Prestwick. The ferry flights themselves were shaping up to be extremely dangerous. The route took them out over the North Sea, then across Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and the Baltic Sea, meaning they flew right through a zone heavily patrolled by enemy fighters. To avoid interception, crews had to fly this long route at the absolute ceiling of the aircraft. To pull off such a risky mission, the Albemarles had to be extensively modified back in England. The The main changes involved the engines and the oil cooling systems. Engineers had to guarantee the performance of a heavy aircraft loaded to maximum gross weight, with hundreds of gallons of aviation fuel, ensuring it could handle a long and grueling climb without the engines overheating. All these complex technical modifications were carried out by British specialists at RAF Shawbury. Before clearing the aircraft for the ferry flights, British test pilots personally verified the performance, making sure the airplane could sustain a prolonged climb with full fuel tanks. On top of that, severe airframe icing was a major issue during these flights. To combat this, engineers tried applying a thick coat of special anti-icing paste, similar in consistency to petroleum jelly, to the aircraft surfaces. In actual flight conditions, however, the paste proved completely ineffective. The transition training program for the Soviet pilots in Scotland turned out to be surprisingly short and highly intensive. The syllabus was kept to a bare minimum, consisting of just 2 dual daytime flights with an instructor, 2 dual night flights, and 4 solo sorties. That was the full extent of their checkout. The pilots had to overcome the language barrier any way they could, simply memorizing a few dozen key terms and standard phrases, which was barely enough for basic communication with the British instructors in the control tower. On March 3, 1943, the first crew took off from RAF Errol in Scotland. The pilot in command was Captain Alexander Sergeyevich Shornikov, flying alongside navigator Lieutenant Pavel Nikolaevich Yakimov. The crew also included radio operator Lieutenant Anatoly Alexandrovich Verderevsky and flight engineer Georgy Ivanovich Galaktionov. They were flying a British twin-engine Albemarle. The weather conditions on this flight were absolutely brutal, and the airframe rapidly picked up ice. The anti-icing paste applied to the leading edges of the wings proved useless, simply mixing right in with the ice accumulation. Once the crew finally reached Soviet airspace, the Albemarle pressed on, navigating entirely by signals from ground-based radio beacons. It was only after a grueling 9-hour flight that the heavy aircraft successfully touched down the following morning at Vnukovo airfield near Moscow. Following that first successful flight, another 12 Albemarles flew the exact same route throughout March and April. They didn't fly empty either. On board each aircraft was highly valuable cargo, including essential tools, scarce spare parts, and specialized aviation equipment. This route was incredibly long and extremely hazardous. Because the flight path went straight over enemy-controlled territory, crews were expecting a sudden attack by German fighters at any moment. To make matters worse, the transport variants of the Albemarle lacked any defensive armament, meaning the standard-issue sidearms of the pilots were the only weapons on board the entire aircraft. To give themselves some sort of protection against interception, the Soviet pilots simply climbed to their maximum altitude. But this route took the heaviest toll on the pilots themselves. Compounding the issue, the Albemarle did not have an autopilot. While it featured a second yoke, crews usually stowed it against the fuselage to keep the narrow crawlway to the nose section clear. The real issue was that each crew only had one pilot, meaning there was literally no one to take the controls during the flight. Hand-flying a heavy twin for 8 to 10 hours straight was physically demanding and highly stressful for a single pilot. Plus, the unpredictable weather posed significant challenges. For instance, the bomber commanded by Captain Ivan Zakharovich Kachanov picked up severe airframe ice during a flight, causing it to pitch down into a dive. The sheer aerodynamic force damaged the radio antennas. The pilot managed to pull out of the dive and level off at a low altitude, but upon breaking out of the clouds over German troop positions, the aircraft came under anti-aircraft fire. The pilot quickly climbed back into the cloud cover. Having lost their bearings and radio contact, the crew flew by the magnetic compass, holding a strict heading due east. After several hours, the overcast broke near the Volga River. As the aircraft approached Kazan, Soviet anti-aircraft gunners opened fire on the unfamiliar silhouette. The damaged aircraft managed to touch down safely, but upon landing, the crew was temporarily detained by local base security. Due to the unusual profile of the aircraft and the foreign flight suits the aviators were wearing, the guards initially suspected them of being enemy spies. Unfortunately, not everyone was lucky enough to make it to their destination, as 2 aircraft went missing during these grueling ferry flights. The first was commanded by Captain Alexei Ivanovich Kulikov, who took off on March 2nd. The second was flown by Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Fyodorovich Ilchenko, and contact with him was lost on April 27th, British warships and patrol planes conducted extensive searches and even sent out official inquiries to the Swedish Coast Guard, but no trace of the missing aircraft was ever found. Much later, historians managed to uncover the true fate of one of them. The Albemarle of Senior Lieutenant Fyodor Fyodorovich Ilchenko had been blown far off course by severe weather and was subsequently shot down by German fighters. Another Soviet crew, commanded by Captain Sergei Alexeyevich Gruzdin, crashed during a training flight in the rugged mountains of Scotland, killing their British instructors alongside them. Meanwhile, other pilots demonstrated significant skill during these missions. Captain Sergei Alexandrovich Frolofsky, for instance, managed to complete 2 successful long-distance ferry flights, one in late March and another in late April. By the end of June that year, Soviet aviators had successfully ferried 11 of these aircraft. Once in the Soviet Union, the aircraft underwent a rigorous testing program. The Air Force Scientific Research Institute extensively evaluated several airframes, while another went to the Flight Research Institute for flight testing. The engineers' final conclusions on the British hardware, however, were highly disappointing. The performance of the aircraft fell significantly short of both Soviet long-range bombers and the PS-84 transports already in active service with the Soviet Air Force. A massive number of flaws became obvious the moment the first British Albemarles reached Soviet operational units. The transports were split evenly between transport and naval aviation. The first aircraft entered service with a transport division based at Vnukovo, just outside Moscow, which was the same unit that had provided the crews for the ferry flights. Shortly after, special-purpose naval aviation units received their aircraft as well. Since the ferry pilots still had more flights to make, they were sent right back to Scotland. This left the new Soviet crews to figure out this completely unfamiliar aircraft entirely on their own. Led by an engineer named Kuznetsov, local ground crews hurriedly threw together a basic systems overview, assembling a maintenance schedule and a flight manual right there on the flight line. By summer, these British aircraft were flying cargo runs deep behind the lines. The aircraft earned the nickname Obermatt among Soviet aviators, who were just as critical of the aircraft as their British counterparts. Engineering reports from the very first flights contained an endless list of defects. Just like in England, pilots heavily criticized the inability to control the oil cooler flaps from the cockpit. Mechanics had to set them on the ground, essentially guessing the required cooling by pinning them open by 1, 2, or 3 holes, with absolutely no way for the crew to adjust them in flight. However, a truly deadly hazard was the lack of an emergency braking system. During an emergency landing in Baku, a brake failure led to tragedy when an Albemarle ran off the runway and smashed into a hangar at high speed, crushing the navigator in the nose section. Another critical engineering oversight was the fundamentally flawed fuel system. Each engine was fed exclusively from its own dedicated group of tanks, with absolutely no cross-feed capability. If an engine quit, all of its remaining fuel instantly became dead weight that simply couldn't be routed to the operating engine. On top of that, the highly corrosive hydraulic fluid relentlessly ate away at the system's copper lines. Dissolved copper would build up in the landing gear extension mechanisms, causing them to jam constantly. The propellers added to the headaches, featuring only 2 pitch settings, coarse and fine, with no intermediate options. This made it impossible for the pilot to dial in an efficient cruise power setting. What was worse, the fittings in the hydraulic control system were butt-welded directly to the lines. Normal in-flight vibration would fatigue these welds until they broke, dumping all the hydraulic fluid. As a result, the props would experience uncommanded pitch changes, leading to massive overspeeds that would literally tear the engines apart. The Soviet transport fleet lost 2 aircraft to this defect alone. Another issue that really frustrated the pilots was the marginal prop clearance, leaving only about 12 inches between the blade tips and the ground. This made taking off a real ordeal, difficult even from a slightly debris-strewn concrete runway, let alone your typical unpaved dirt strip. Since the Albemarle was originally designed as a bomber, it was woefully ill-suited as a transport aircraft. The cabin was incredibly cramped, and structural cross-bracing cluttered the entire space. Trying to move from the cockpit to the rear fuselage was extremely difficult, sometimes forcing crews to literally crawl on their hands and knees. Usually, these planes were only trusted to haul urgent cargo in the aft section. To its credit, the Albemarle did outperform the Soviet PS-84, better known as the Li-2, in both speed and range. The Soviet command only attempted to send this British aircraft behind German lines to drop propaganda leaflets once. The aircraft's reliability was so abysmal that rarely did a flight go by without a major system failure, making crossing the front line in it highly dangerous. There was also an attempt to use the Albemarle for jump training. However, after the very first test flight at Tushino, flown by Mikhail Grigoriev's crew, the idea was completely scrapped. The narrow fuselage, cluttered with tubular trusses, made it nearly impossible for paratroopers to safely navigate to the jump door, and the door itself was simply too small for combat jumps. Interestingly, despite its engine power, the USSR never even attempted to use the aircraft as a tow plane for heavy cargo gliders. After carefully reviewing the disastrous first few weeks of operating the Albemarle in the Soviet Union, a special commission led by Marshal Astakov delivered a harsh verdict. They recommended immediately halting any further deliveries, or at the very least, demanding an extensive overhaul of the design. By May, all ferry flights of new airframes were completely grounded. In September, the Soviet government officially rejected a batch of 100 aircraft, issuing a strict demand to heavily modify another 86 airframes before they ever took to the skies again. By the end of the summer of 1943, American C-47 transports began arriving at Soviet transport squadrons in massive numbers. Once Soviet pilots gained experience with these exceptionally reliable aircraft, they did everything they could to phase out the problematic British planes. Meanwhile, the ferry crews kept up their intensive training in Scotland right up until April 18, 1944. During this time, they were also training on another aircraft, the legendary Mosquito, for which the Soviet Union had its own special plans. However, the Soviet military leadership soon outright rejected the final batch of 86 Albemarles as well. Consequently, the training unit was disbanded on April 30th, and all Soviet crews headed home via the long sea route. So what happened to the 12 British aircraft that actually managed to reach Soviet territory? Their service lives turned out to be incredibly short, lasting only about a year and a half. In that relatively brief window, at least 2 airframes were completely written off in severe crashes. One of these transports, for instance, crashed directly into a lake near Sverdlovsk. Eventually, the decision was made to hand over the remaining airworthy aircraft to naval aviation. In total, the Navy ended up with 7 Albemarles, tasked with routine but critical work hauling cargo between rear echelon airfields far behind the front lines. In 1944, a couple of the surviving airframes were sent to the Sigismund Levanevsky Higher Naval Aviation School, which was then based in Bezinchuk near the Volga River. A little later, 3 more aircraft arrived from an airfield near Moscow. At the school, all the Albemarles were assigned to a training regiment to train future navigators. To turn these transports into proper bomber trainers, mechanics had to put in some serious work. Inside the spacious fuselage, they installed 6 seats for the cadets, mounted bombsight brackets at each station, and fitted underwing racks for practice bombs. When the school later relocated to Mykolaiv, the aircraft went with it. Interestingly, when the war in Europe ended on May 9, 1945, 2 Albemarles were still officially in active service. However, by the fall of that same year, they were finally struck from the register and scrapped. Historical records also show that 2 of the aircraft made their way down to Azerbaijan, where a specialized reserve aviation regiment was stationed. They focused entirely on transitioning Soviet crews to newly arrived Lend-lease aircraft. At this base, the British bombers were used strictly as flying classrooms, and records indicate that at least one of these trainers was written off in a crash in late 1943. So what exactly was the AW-41? Structurally, it was a conventional twin-engine monoplane, but the initial design brief had highly specific and rigid requirements. Because of this, the engineers had to make some serious compromises, forcing them to fall back on design methods that had been standard in the early 1930s. They were essentially relying on concepts that were already obsolete. The primary fuselage structure was a standard tubular steel framework reinforced with internal bracing. Over this heavy frame, they simply attached a non-load-bearing plywood skin. The only modern touch was the use of stainless steel for the framework of the nose section. Honestly, the wing was a bit of a Frankenstein design built from a mix of wood and steel. The wing center section relied on heavy steel spars, while the outer wing panels featured a wooden structure. Most of the internal ribs were also made of wood. The leading edge of the wing was formed from aluminum alloy to handle aerodynamic loads, but the rest of the wing was, once again, skinned in standard plywood. The tail section featured a twin tail empennage with a primary structure made of wood and covered in that same plywood. Only the rudders utilized a steel frame which was simply fabric covered to keep the weight down. Because this design was so remarkably primitive, manufacturing the aircraft components was incredibly easy. A standard furniture factory or a railcar repair shop could handle the job, and even a decently equipped garage workshop could do it without much trouble.